And this year we're thrilled to move up to the mountains and to tell the story of the Episcopal Church in the 1840s and really throughout the 19th century, concentrating on the episcopate of Bishop Levi Silliman Ives, and who was a leading proponent of what we call the High Church or Oxford movement here in the United States and the American Episcopal Church. And then also talking about the mission of the Episcopal Church here in the mountains of North Carolina. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Stuart Hoke, who will give the first of our presentations. Stuart now calls North Carolina home, I'm happy to say. Before moving to North Carolina, Stuart was in New York City, serving at Trinity Church Wall Street, and also in New York earned his doctorate in General Seminary, and before that served parishes in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, I believe. And Stuart, academic work is in the field of the Anglo-Catholic movement in the Episcopal Church. And so he is going to speak to us about Bishop Ives and about that High Church tradition. Stuart, thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
A few weeks ago at the church I'm currently serving, not too far from here, I announced this History Day to a crowd of Episcopal churchwomen, a large crowd. I briefly outlined its purpose and theme and noted that I would be one of the speakers and that the door was open to anyone and everyone who wished to participate. In my announcement, I must have used the adjective high, because a loud moan went up somewhere in the middle of the room when a prominent churchwoman remarked, "Oh, here we go again with more smells and bells." Now, if you ask me, I'm ready to have morning prayer just like we always used to do it. No, madam, we did not ask you. You historians here present will no doubt join me with an even louder moan as one more time we hear the reductionism of a great historical corrective of the life of the church to a sprinkle of incense and the tinkle of a sanctus bell. Liturgical adiaphoros such as these constitute but the tiniest and most insignificant portion of the High Church movement that swept Anglicanism during the mid-19th century. A movement, in my estimation, that saved this beloved church of ours from starvation, stagnation, and death. Had it not been for this major thrust of back to the basics, we would not be sitting here today as Catholic Episcopalians free. Are you all familiar with that phrase? Catholics, you are. I see you laughing. Some of us learned that song that houses it when we were knee-high to a credence table. Sing it with me if you know it. I am an Anglican, I am CE, neither high church nor low church, but a Protestant, but a Catholic Episcopalian free, not a Lutheran, nor a Presby, nor a Baptist, white with foam. I am an Anglican, just one step from Rome. I am an Anglican, boom, boom. You got to do something with church history or it becomes dry as dirt. In the year 1833, a young professor of poetry, note that, of poetry at Oxford University, who is also an ordained priest of the Church of England, a man by the name of John Keble preached a sockdolager of a sermon at St. Mary's Church, Oxford. Oxford being the heart and mind of 19th century Anglican theology and practice, and the home of most, if not all, the ecclesiastical movers and shakers of the church in England, as they referred to it not the Church of England. Do you get the difference? It is huge, and you will see why in just a moment. With a recent enactment of a new law allowing Parliament to shoehorn her pushy ways into the life of the English Church, such as drawing lines for new dioceses and eliminating old ones, such as draining the treasuries of the church coffers and giving the money to build bridges in the country, such as disregarding bishops and their apostolic authority, such as allowing Irish Roman Catholics now elected to Parliament to make decisions affecting English church life, Keble went into high gear in that sermon. He railed against government's incursion into the church's business, and he declared it an apostasy. Oh, dear God, what a strong and inflammatory word. It's tantamount to saying that the crown had rejected the divine and had abandoned her religion, and a battle royal was enjoined. Dr. Keble entitled his sermon, National Apostasy, and it's there for the reading all over the internet. And before long, a very sleepy and self-satisfied national church began to wake up to the reality that the community of Christ in England had become little more than an agency of the government, something like an outdated, outmoded, anachronistic welfare society ruled by stuffy episcocrats. Within months of Keble's attempt to shatter the scales of denial, months, not years, clergy and some of the laity became visibly irritated and discontent, and they showed it. Bemoaning what had become of their somnolent church and calling for reform and revitalization from within, urging what I would call a back to the basics movement. Back to the basics, back to the primitive church. Underline primitive, it is a great word. Through printed tracts and feisty sermons, these early firebrands who headquartered at Oxford started speaking out about such things as holiness, the unity of the church, its Catholicity, its apostolicity. In other words, the church is holy because it is Jesus on this earth. It is one throughout the world, albeit with distinct branches, such as Eastern Orthodoxy, the Roman Church, and the Anglican Church, to wit, a significant branch of the Universal Church in England. So you call it the church in England, not of England. It's also apostolic, with origins going all the way back to the times of the apostles, with modern-day bishops and priests deriving their role, their status, and most importantly, their authority, their ability to use power in a good way. They derive their authority from Jesus and from the 12. And the church is Catholic, they said. That is to say, universal, whole, worldwide, complete, and not subject anywhere on this earth to the dictates, the demands, or the whims of a local government. We take that for granted, but they helped us in that world. The movement instigated by Keble and his sermon on national apostasy was known as the Tractarian movement. Save that, hold that. Because of the 90 tracts published and disseminated throughout the intelligentsia of the church in England. In addition to Keble, the other three notables of this first wave of what we later called Anglo-Catholicism was a man named Harold Froude, another poet, note that, and also a theologian. There was Edward Pusey, another theologian and a dyed-in-the-wool Anglican and anything but a poet. And John Henry Newman, a priest, a theologian, and a brilliant mastermind of the tracts. Newman eventually left the Church of England, and to use the term that they used back then, he perverted to the Church of Rome. He didn't convert, he didn't revert, he didn't divert, he perverted. And guess what they called him? If you're one who perverts, then you must be a pervert. The tracts indeed did attempt to return to the basics, and they covered such a wide swath of topics. Topics that you and I would take for granted as part of just a plain old garden variety, plain vanilla inquirer's class curriculum. But that stagnant English church, here they were considered revivification by some and absolute revolution by others. Here were the topics, such things as apostolic succession. They've forgotten that, as we have. Authority of bishops and priests. The Catholic nature of the church. The sacraments and the creeds, the liturgy. And get this, the accretions of Roman Catholicism and the diminutions of Protestantism. You see where that puts the Anglican Church? And finally, the last pamphlet in the series of 90, and it was the straw that broke the camel's back. And in this case, it was the bishop's backs. John Henry Newman promulgating a Catholic interpretation of the 39 Articles. Oh, suffice it to say, that is an oxymoron. That is a Rubik's Cube. That is a Molotov cocktail all rolled into one. And a firestorm generated by it was enough to defuse Newman, put him in his place. We didn't hear much from him again. It caused him to withdraw from the fracas, eventually the church, and to settle down, and note this, with a small group of semi-monastic men in a rural school-like atmosphere where they said morning and evening offices every day, celebrated Holy Communion on a frequent basis, heard each other's confessions, practiced mortification of the flesh, God knows what they practiced, kept silence, and observed the traditional feasts and fasts, and read voraciously both the patristics and the mystics in addition to Scripture. In the decades that followed, more than a few enclaves such as these made appearances throughout the Anglican communion. And some even transformed themselves into honest-to-God, old-fashioned, newly purposed monastic communities. The first in this country was the Other Order of the Holy Cross, established in 1882 in the Northeast. And of course, one of these little enclaves was housed right here on the ground on which you're sitting. And more on that in just a second.